So excited. The topic today is... Welcome back to day 2 of my vlog here. Microaggressions today. This morning we're doing a recap of...
$30 billion and a lot used to pay for financial aid. The total cost for 1 year as an undergraduate, so for undergraduates, $72,000. Now you say,
of Harvard's campus, and one thing that I did not know was how accessible it is to come to school here as an undergraduate based on the sliding scale of your parents' income.
All your labels, share your labels.
Day 2, it feels like we've been here all week, right?
It's been heavy.
Box Club.
Box Club.
44. With Charlie, thank you for having us.
thank you.
This is the building where Mark Zuckerberg.
Hey y'all, welcome back to day 2. So as you saw in the video, today was a lot. We did so much. It was really good, all good. It was heavy. Today was heavy, so heavy. I cried in class today. Several people did. So I'll tell you a little bit about, give you a brief overview of the day. So we started the day with a post-dinner discussion. So from the dinner in the dark from last night, the facilitator came back in. Oh, and one correction for ETI. I think in the video yesterday I said ETI stood for engagement through integration. It's actually empowerment through integration, which makes a lot more sense, right? With what I described. So it's empowerment through integration. But we talked a little bit about the objectives of the interaction and then what people took away from it, and how we want to, you know, make changes or implement the learnings in our life and in our work. And one of the things that was so like just front and center about the entire experience was this whole idea of making sure that every voice is included, and how do you go about ensuring every voice is included, and then also noticing when a voice is not included. And one of the things that we did at my table, and that I noticed myself doing, so we couldn't, I shared this yesterday, we couldn't share any labels. So no name, hometown, title, organization, or much about your work experience. So it was interesting because we, in lieu of names, gave each other names by colors. So like I was red, the lady next to me was pink, then there was orange, then there was green, there was blue, and then there was black, and then there was me. Like I still remember the order. But it was interesting because throughout the facilitated prompts, we were listening for all of the colors. So if there was a question and, you know, orange didn't respond, like I even would find myself like leaning in closer to the table to even make sure that I could hear orange that, you know, was across from me, or, well, no, it was green that was across from me. And also noticing when, okay, black, you know, do you have something to add? And it was so interesting that because we were blindfolded, we were more sensitive to making sure that everyone at the table had an opportunity to speak. And so that was definitely something that was a big heart takeaway. The other point was just more so around not having the label. So again, like for me personally, it was a great self-awareness moment about how much I determine or think through and process how I fit into a space based on the work experiences of the people that are in that group. So even, you know, of course, there was a big point around just, you know, bias and giving people the space to be vulnerable and to share all of who they are beyond what they do. But then I even noticed for me, like I even process, okay, how do I fit into this context based on what I know about the career experiences of those that I'm interacting with? And to have that stripped away forced me and really everyone at my table to connect on a much deeper level. So that was really, really interesting. It also had me thinking about, many of you probably have either been in an interview as an interviewee or conducted an interview as an interviewer, where there is a section on the guide around fit and motivational fit, and how we prioritize that, and how that can oftentimes, looking for talent that fits, can promote bias and can promote, you know, unconscious bias and even, you know, prejudice in the workplace versus thinking about how can I identify talent that adds and that doesn't fit the team but adds to the team. So some really great discussions around that exercise. And then that's when the day really got started. So we went into this conversation around addressing racial inequality. And so Dr. Livingston, who is the professor, he's the faculty chair for the program. So when I say his name this week, you'll know who he is. But he forced us to take a look at the data. And based on the research, most of the research is around interactions between whites and blacks. So that was the majority of the conversation. And we really talked about, you know, one, is it even a problem? Like, one, is racism real? So we dealt with that question. And then two, is it a problem? And it was very interesting that by the end of the day, most people in the room came to this realization that the system, like all of the systemic injustice and inequality, is operating as it was intended. That there was this, and it was extremely interesting to hear this kind of revelation from the white classmates in the room that, you know, perhaps much of what we experience and classify as racial prejudice and racial inequality is a part of the fabric of our country, and is operating exactly as it was intended. So it was interesting to see that process take place in the room of, okay, this is, you know, much bigger than, you know, this one incident or taking a knee or not taking a knee during the national anthem. So we had all of those conversations and all of that revelation through much of the research and the data that was being presented and that we had to read. Of course, we got to read before coming here. So it was really, really interesting to unpack that in the room, especially with so many, you know, with who was in the room. I think for me was the other piece of it. So really, really fascinating discussions around that. And then there was also some data that I thought was really surprising that was shared around how presently there are white people, a significant amount of white people who believe that there is more racism against whites than there is against blacks. And so we unpacked that in the room. We defined and got really clear on the differences from a definition standpoint around stereotypes, discrimination, and prejudice, and the differences between those three and what they mean. And this really hard takeaway from the professor, even in sharing about how he opens himself up to other opportunities. He talked about how he serves in the way of addressing behaviors instead of bias. And I thought that was so interesting. It took me a minute to like process that, because he was saying how, you know, he gets requests to come and do trainings and workshops on unconscious bias, and how he won't do it because we all have bias, and you'll never be able to really eradicate bias, but you can change behavior. And so he talked about how his work is focused on making changes in behavior, and gave this really great analogy to Brussels sprouts, and how, you know, most people initially don't like the taste of Brussels sprouts, but because we know the health advantages of having 3 servings of Brussels sprouts per day, you know, people will do what it takes to make Brussels sprouts palatable and work through that initial, like, ooh, these are nasty, or this conversation is uncomfortable around race, in order to get to the additive benefit and the change in behavior of actually going to a restaurant and now ordering Brussels sprouts soaked in bacon, because that's what makes it palatable. But we do what it takes so that we can get the benefit, which causes us to have to change our behavior to go from not liking Brussels sprouts to liking them. So he likened that to conversations around racism and just the awareness, and just how historically in this country, we've swept a lot of our issues around race under the rug. So you never get to this change in behavior, because oftentimes people are so uncomfortable even engaging in a conversation around what we all know is an issue. So I thought that analogy, and that after he explained it, I kind of was like, okay, that makes sense, because most, especially corporations, like the crux of a lot of the D&I training, if you will, is around unconscious bias. So I thought that was very, very interesting in terms of how he unpacked that for us. Then we looked at some data, which was super interesting, around what propels Black leaders to the top. So of the Black leaders who are either, you know, in the C-suite, hold a high standing political office, or are more in a senior level position at a corporation, what is it that makes them, that helps them to get there? And there were kind of these 3 things that this set of research identified around competence, diligence, and credentials. We talked also about this idea of baby faceness, which I did not know was a thing until today. So that was an interesting conversation, and how, just like it sounds, your facial features, having a baby face, how that impacts white men versus Black men and white women. Very, very interesting conversation. And that was all before lunch. So after lunch, we watched the documentary 13. I had not watched, I was familiar with the documentary, but I hadn't watched it until today. And the conversation was, how can I describe? It was very heavy, but it was also very illuminating. So if you are familiar, 13 is a documentary on the 13th Amendment, which of course abolished slavery, about how there is this loophole in the 13th Amendment. I think the language is like, except as punishment for a crime. And so this documentary by Ava DuVernay unpacks the new slavery, or the new Jim Crow of mass incarceration, and the impact of that on Black Americans, particularly Black men. And it's heavy. And so we were kind of course, given that disclaimer up front. Of course, there were people in the room that had already seen the documentary and had been preparing all day, myself included, because I was aware of it, but hadn't seen it for this reason. Quite honestly, I knew that it was heavy. So it was interesting, the conversation after that. I and many others in the room that looked like me and didn't look like me were, you know, understandably emotional After it evoked a lot of emotion, even some conflicting emotion, which was really interesting. And so that was a very illuminating conversation, and I really appreciated Professor Livingston challenging those in the room that were initially silent. So he specifically asked the white men in the room to share their responses and their feelings and what they thought about the documentary. And there were some really interesting conversations, particularly by one gentleman who was the CEO of a police station here, or police department here in the Boston area. And he talked about a lot of the policies and, how he trains his 160 something cops and what they do in the community to try to facilitate this connection and really conversation around police brutality in Black communities. So very interesting, deep conversation. And then, as you saw, we went on a tour of Harvard. What the one thing that I'll say about the tour that you probably didn't see in the video was just, I was amazed and was not aware of how accessible Harvard is. So they have the best financial aid. So for the undergraduate programs, if your parents make less than $250,000, so one, let me back up. It costs like $71,000 something a year to attend Harvard as an graduate. And so if your parents make less than $250,000, then there's this sliding scale that they use for financial aid. If you come from a household that makes less than $65,000, you come to Harvard for free, fully paid. And not only is your tuition, housing, books, and everything paid for, but they provide a stipend to you to help with additional costs like purchasing a laptop or other materials that you would need. Wow, did not know that. So it's kind of like, man, I should have applied to Harvard for undergrad. No, I'm kidding. I had the best time at UT Knoxville. Go Vols. But I thought that was really, really interesting. The tour, the campus is beautiful. So you got to see some of that. And then last thing, ended the evening. So the tour was absolutely voluntary. So, and ended up being 2 groups. So I picked a group. But afterwards, some of the classmates wanted to go to dinner. So we had dinner and of course unpacked the day, had more discussion, and then just kind of talked about, what we do and our backgrounds and how we, are going to take just what we've learned so far in like a day and a half, and what we want to do when we go back. Really, really, really amazing connections tonight. So that's it. Today was incredible. Professor Livingston did say that today was the hardest day. So he's like, we're over the hump now, but very heavy, but extremely illuminating. So illuminating and so much self and also social awareness out of today. So yeah, see y'all on the next one.